Okay, so today I want to talk a little bit about human behavior and how the brain works. So, fundamentally, we're going to start with this premise that we are wired to survive in environments of scarcity. Okay, which begs the question, how do you survive in environments of scarcity? The first thing you need to do is to consume as much high-calorie food as possible whenever you have access to it, because who knows when you'll come across it again. You need to fight over the best resources because whoever gets the best resources is more likely to get healthier, stronger, and live longer and live long enough to reproduce. And reproduction is the name of the game. And you need to conserve your energy. Take the path of least resistance, avoid excess effort, and seek ease. And our brains are equipped with dopamine reward structures to get us to do these behaviors. Now, what does this behavior look like? Seek as much instant gratification as possible. Conserve your energy. Avoid work, put off pain, discomfort, and responsibility. Get what you want with least effort expended, which also includes mental effort. And mental effort is much more difficult than physical effort. So, if you can get what you want by whining and crying and throwing a fit, then do that. It's primitive. It's natural. It's our wiring to keep us alive. Okay, so let me ask you, what does that sound like? Does that sound like anyone you know? Perhaps your teenager? How do you feel about that behavior? Do we get frustrated, upset, disappointed? Do we feel like it's disrespectful, lazy, selfish, entitled, shameful, unmotivated, undisciplined, childish, and immature? Okay, now, we are wired to repeat actions that release dopamine. But in our day and age, smart people have figured out how to hack the dopamine reward system with video games, social media, sugar, etc., and they found a way to profit off of it. There are some things that release a lot of dopamine. Certain substances accidentally trigger our brains to release dopamine, like marijuana, cocaine, opioids, and alcohol. Other things that release dopamine are porn, gambling, anger, caffeine, and other drugs like nicotine. The natural thing to do would be to repeat those behaviors. We don't have to get into the consequences of excess dopamine in the brain this time, but what that should look like is someone who avoids work and responsibility, plays a lot of video games and is always on their phone, and if they try drugs, to keep doing them. Okay. Now, can we let go of our apprehension and just have a little compassion and empathy? For a moment, just put our fears and all the implications on pause and just go, dang, I can see where my kid's coming from. There's not actually something wrong with them. This isn't some weird, shameful behavior. In fact, it's completely natural. Our kids aren't broken, at least at that level, the level of the lizard brain. Now, the prefrontal cortex is another matter. The prefrontal cortex is part of the neocortex, or the new brain. It is responsible for emotional regulation, impulse control, logic, reason, and rational thought. In other words, the tools to put off the lizard brain and make decisions for long-term benefits like health and relationships. So you can see why the prefrontal cortex is so important. However, there's a chemical called cortisol that is released when we feel threatened. It activates the fight or flight response in our lizard brain, but fight or flight requires a lot of energy. So cortisol also diverts energy away from things like the digestive system, the immune system, and, you guessed it, the prefrontal cortex. Because the prefrontal cortex uses a lot of energy. Chess masters are said to burn several thousand calories during matches, just as a side note. So, in essence, cortisol activates fight or flight, aggression or avoidance, and turns off impulse control, emotional regulation, and rational thought. Not a great state to be in or to have your kid in, which begs the question, what releases cortisol? So, let me go back to our primitive beginnings of survival in environments of scarcity. We are wired to want the best resources, but who gets the best resources? The ones who can fight the others off, right? In other words, the biggest, the baddest, the meanest. the strongest, the alphas. But what happens when two alphas fight over resources? They usually get injured, both of them, and one is likely to die. So then what happens when some second-rate beta comes along? It easily beats the injured alpha and takes the best resources, and it gets to pass on its genes. Not a good system for the alphas, and not a good system for the species. We don't want some second-rate beta genes getting passed on, because then our kids are less likely to survive and the species is less likely to survive. So we needed to find a way to resolve disputes without resorting to violence. We started to gauge whether or not we would win in a fight. Who's bigger, who's stronger, meaner, and more aggressive? But we're also social animals. So we started to use metrics like competence, social popularity, confidence, intelligence, attractiveness, success, money, position, authority, influence, trust, and credibility as a determining factor of status. We became highly sensitive and attuned to where we were in comparison to everyone else. In other words, our status. This is what the essence of status is. But each social circle has its own metrics for status. For some, it might be the size of your house. For others, it might be how frugal you are. Whatever that community respects. We are wired to defer to people higher than us and to avoid conflict. We are wired to defer to people higher than us to avoid conflict. So everyone defers to people at the top and at the bottom, and the people at the bottom defer to everyone else. Everyone else is in this dance with everyone else. It's great to be at the top. You get all the best resources, all the girls, all the guys, and all the best perks. And the bottom sucks. You get the scraps if you get anything. Everyone is a threat, so you always have to be ready to run away at any second or attack like a cornered rat if you feel trapped. You have to be ready for anything and everything. Cortisol. Drip, drip, drip. Constant fight or flight. And no energy for these other systems. You don't get any of the girls, you don't get any respect or anything good. And anything good you get that you just so happen to stumble across gets taken away quick. So you have to make the most of those moments and then conserve your energy every chance you get. You have to do your best to avoid conflicts, avoid pissing anyone off or making them feel uncomfortable. You want to make sure every stranger likes you so they don't see you as a threat. You need to be a people pleaser, timid, avoidant, etc. Always on edge and anxious. And you are worthless and a loser, so you're also depressed. Cortisol courses through your veins. No one wants to be at the bottom. No one wants to be lower than they need to be. So any threat to status, your intelligence, competence, credibility, desirability, lovability, attractiveness, importance, respect, etc., is perceived as a threat to your access to resources, a threat to move down the status hierarchy towards the bottom. In other words, a threat on our very lives and must be responded to as such. And how do we survive? Fight or flight. Cortisol, baby. So any threat to any of these things triggers a release of cortisol, which activates the fight or flight and turns off the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and rational thought. Our brains are also wired to infer the negative. Why? Because if I see a black spot out of the corner of my eye and I jump and then realize that it wasn't anything, it was just a shadow, then I get to live to die another day, right? The amount of energy expended was negligible. I jumped. However, if I see a black motion out of the corner of my eye and I don't react and it turns out to be a venomous spider and it bites me, then I'm going to be in for a miserable couple of hours or even days if I don't die. So the amount of energy expended there is significantly higher than the amount of energy expended from just jumping out of the way. So we have a negative bias we have a bias towards the negative, right? To assume the negative, to infer the negative. It's a survival mechanism because people who did that survived, people who didn't survive and didn't get to pass on their genes. Okay, so People that overreact survive, people that don't. Hence a tendency towards the negative bias. So even when people don't mean anything by it, we naturally negatively interpret what they do or say as an insinuated threat and biologically react accordingly. But guess what soothes stress? Dopamine. And we already talked about all the things that release dopamine. Those things become coping mechanisms for this stress of status conflicts and cortisol and everything else and all these threats. Anyways, and because of the inherent nature of dopamine, they become addictions, kind of like what we went over before. Okay, so what are the things that can be interpreted as threats? Anything that gives a sense of uncertainty or scarcity to our lovability or security. Responding inappropriately to vulnerability. Any contempt, judgment, disappointment, disapproval, disgust, anger, frustration, shame, blame, annoyance, anxiety, worry, stress, disagreement, unfair treatment, injustice, hypocrisy, failure, etc. Why? Because of fundamental learned beliefs like, I have to be perfect to be loved, and any mistake I make makes me less wanted and less valuable and less lovable. So any insinuation that someone is wrong or mistaken.